Greetings and welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I talked a lot about overcoming Jim Crow, and the focus of the last lecture was that the civil rights movement initially really began in the courts, and that over a 16-year period, the NAACP and primarily Thurgood Marshall was able to eventually overturn the separate but equal doctrine that was established in Plessy versus Ferguson. So we ended with Brown versus the Board of Education. It was a great legal victory, although southern states refused in many cases to implement. At this point, Thurgood Marshall is stuck. There is no way to attack the private discrimination that was established in the civil rights cases of 1883. And what we have is a movement out of the courts and really to the streets. And so if you look at your notes, it's titled Civil Rights Movement, or Movement in the Streets. The civil rights movement, usually in textbooks, begins with Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. in the Montgomery bus boycott, and certainly I will get there in just a second. But I did note that there were some landmark events that occurred in the 1940s. The integration of Major League Baseball with Jackie Robinson in 1947 was quite an event. Major League Baseball, of course, had been segregated for decades. We have really a couple of courageous men involved in this story. Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, was willing to break the color barrier, to have someone integrate baseball. He recruited Jackie Robinson, had him play for a year in Montreal before joining the Brooklyn Dodgers. And the integration of Major League Baseball with Jackie Robinson was not a magical event, in the sense that as soon as the rest of the team saw what a great player Jackie Robinson was, and he did win Rookie of the Year, many teams were still resistant to integrate. For example, the last team to integrate in Major League Baseball did not integrate until 1959. So the Boston Red Sox were the last team to integrate. So it took a dozen years. And if you were to do some research on baseball, you would discover that National League teams were much more likely to integrate to a much more thorough degree. They did it earlier, they did it more completely. And one of the results of this was that the balance of power began to shift in Major League Baseball, and the National League became the stronger league over time because they were more proactive in terms of integration. The other event that I mentioned at the top of your notes is probably the more important one socially. There have been thousands of people who have been touched by Major League Baseball, but the number of people touched by the desegregation of the military by executive order, it's a lot. I don't even know how much more. So put some stars next to that. I do think that one of the questions that I will ask you on the second exam is what president desegregated the military by executive order. Your answer is going to be Harry Truman. It is a sad state of affairs, I think, that in World War II, when we were fighting a great evil, Nazi Germany and its racist regime, that we were fighting with segregated military units. And so it is not until the Korean conflict that for the first time we have the integration of our military and we are fighting as one fighting force. I know that this was one of the appeals in John Kennedy's speech for the Civil Rights Act. He said that when we go off and fight a war, we don't just ask white men to make a sacrifice for their country. We ask men of all colors, and of course that was part of his pitch for legal equity and for the passage of what eventually became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I wanted to touch on those two events, and now I will get to the civil rights movement in the streets. I'm going to talk about the movement by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is a hero to me. I'll tell you the story in just a little bit. But essentially, the way that I like to think of the civil rights movement with Dr. King is to tell the picture with three photographs, with three snapshots. The first picture is the beginning of the movement. The beginning of the movement begins in December of 1955 when Rosa Parks, who was a seamstress, she was also a local secretary for the NAACP, refused to give her seat on a bus to an unidentified white man. I believe she was fined $13 for this. And this fine prompts a 381-day boycott of the bus lines by a young pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott was a political and social protest against segregation on public transit, in this case, the bus lines in Montgomery, Alabama. The boycott ended because the following year, in 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the city of Montgomery to integrate their bus lines, to end the white-only and so-called colored sections. So the Montgomery bus boycott really gives Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. his start. Over the next 7 or 8 years, the civil rights movement is predominantly a movement within the black community in the South. That does not mean that there wasn't white support, and I'll give you an example. I told you the story of my mentor at UC Davis and how he and his mother escaped the death camps and ended up in New York City. And the result of that is that they became very, very early supporters. The Jewish community in general were very generous with their financial support. If there was a group of people in America who understood racism even more than those in the black community, it was Jews, some of which had been in concentration camps or had family members die in the death camps. And so certainly they understood, they felt empathetic to this community that was facing tremendous racial discrimination. But most of America was apathetic to the movement. They weren't supporters, they weren't opponents. Their primary thinking was it's the South, it's a strange place, which in many ways, as I've told you throughout this course, is kind of true. And of course, within the Southern community, there was tremendous white opposition. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. gets some unlikely help. In the early 1960s, the most powerful newsman in America is somebody you probably never heard of. His name was Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite, even though he was a Texan, was very, very supportive very early on of the civil rights movement. And he began sending reporters into the South and began reporting out some of the things that were occurring in the southern part of this country. The most famous reporter that went and investigated was a young man named Dan Rather. And in the second event that I have in your notes, the Birmingham March, Dan Rather plays a significant part. Dr. King had led numerous marches, essentially for two things. One, for desegregation of public accommodations, those bars, restaurants, theaters, gas stations, etc. And for voting rights. Remember that political neutralization was still occurring throughout the southern part of this country. Dr. King had given a lot of speeches in Birmingham. In fact, he had been jailed the previous month in April, and if any of you in a humanities or English class were ever asked to read a letter from a Birmingham jail that was written in April of 1963 by Dr. King. So the next month, it is now May of 1963, Dr. King leads a march that was met with violence by the local police and by their brutal police commissioner, a man named Eugene Bull Connor. But what was different about this march was that CBS and Dan Rather broadcast the violence of the government, the violence of Bull Connor nationwide, and the result was an almost overnight change in public opinion. Excuse me. Dr. King goes from being a regional figure in the South to a national figure. Dr. King receives an outpouring of support as a result. And this change in public opinion prompts President Kennedy to make a very dramatic speech. I don't have it listed in your notes, but if you want to write it down in the side, and in fact, if you want to look it up on YouTube, I would really suggest this. This is one of President Kennedy's finest moments as president. He gives a televised address on June 11th, 1963, in which he makes the case for a Civil Rights Act. In this speech, President Kennedy calls the civil rights movement a revolution. And the general gist of this speech, the theme of this speech, is that when the rights of every man, are diminished, the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man is threatened. And so in this particular case, President Kennedy is saying that all people should be concerned about segregation, about discrimination, that in our great country, when one group of people's rights are threatened, all of our rights are threatened and all of our rights are diminished. And of course, we get the highlight. So the first photograph, the beginning of the movement, was the Montgomery bus boycott. The second photograph was the Birmingham March. And finally, the third is the Washington March for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. King gives what I believe is his greatest political address in his famous I Have a Dream speech from the Lincoln Memorial. The speech was broadcast nationally on every major network in this country on live television. In this speech, Dr. King envisions a colorblind society. His dream is a colorblind society in which all of God's children can play with one another. In this case, he envisions a society where men and women are judged not by something as superficial as our skin color, but something more meaningful. In this case, our character. This speech, along with Dr. King's other work, gets him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And at this point, it appears the country may actually be ready to introduce civil rights legislation for the first time in almost 100 years. And unfortunately, a great tragedy, and this is my first political memory as a child. Unfortunately, President Kennedy was in Dallas. He understood that Southerners saw this attempt at civil rights legislation as unpopular. President Kennedy was in Dallas trying to mend fences politically when, unfortunately, President Kennedy becomes the last president to die in office. He died due to an assassin's bullet in Dallas in November of 1963. And in this particular case, Lyndon Johnson tells the country that we owe our martyred president his civil rights agenda. And so in one of those great ironies, we have a Southerner, Lyndon Johnson, a Texan. And it is during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson that we get two prominent civil rights acts passed, actually three, but two of them that I'll talk about. The Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, And then in the next lecture, I will also talk about affirmative action.